we now come to the first chapter of part 7. This chapter is entitled The Great War, the World in Upheaval. And actually the Great War is the way that World War I was known at that time, because the world had never seen a war that big. And people never thought that would be one even bigger, just a couple decades down the road. So that's how the World War I is still known as the Great War. So the focus of this chapter is the period of World War I from 1914 to 1918. What led to its outbreak and to its global expansion, the different groups of people that were affected by it and were involved in it, and how the world's balance of power was transformed. So within this chapter, we are going to focus first on the drift toward war, the global war, and then the end of the war. So in looking at how the world drifted toward this war, we remember that the European countries of Greece, Italy, and Germany had acquired their national unification and independence by 1871. However, there were many more people in Europe who had nationalist aspirations, and these were concentrated mainly in the region of the Balkans, the mountains that are north and northwest of Greece. These people were under the jurisdiction of the Austrian Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and some of them were also under the jurisdiction of the Ottoman Empire, based in Turkey. So there were many groups, many populations in Europe whose nationalist aspirations had not been fulfilled. These included the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Serbs, the Croats, and the Slovenes, and also other groups. So what happened when once the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, the center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, visited the Serbian city of Sarajevo, and the patriot shot him. That was Ferdinand of Austria in 1914 was shot. That was a little sparkle that really ignited this power keg that Europe was already. So clearly there were national rivalries that existed among industrialized nations who obviously competed for territories to be used as colonies for the plantations that would provide them with the primary materials for their industrial economy. So, of course, Great Britain was very wary of the surging power of Germany in both industry and seafaring. In other words, Germany was developing a very strong industrial base in the territory of Germany, and also very powerful seafaring techniques that enabled it to dominate certain areas of the seas that Great Britain was accustomed to controlling. So a number of disputes about colonial territories, were significant enough to really create this power keg that exploded when the Duke was assassinated in Sarajevo. For example, in Persia, which today we know as Iran, the two powers of Britain and Russia tended to have a conflict there for dominance of that region. In Siam, which today we know as Thailand, France and Britain were contending that area. And then in Morocco, that area was contended between Germany and France. And these are just some of the examples of these colonial national rivalries for the domination of colonial territories. Finally, another factor was public opinion. By this time, the mass media are quite significant in the world. People buy the newspapers every day, and so and the newspapers are cheap enough that most people can afford them, and so therefore one of the ways that newspapers sell is by sensationalizing news, and therefore that caused public opinion to become more polarized depending on what perspective they got. So there had been certain alliances and understandings that were in place for a while before the assassination of Sarajevo. And that made it possible for that little sparkle to ignite the whole keg. Let's look at those. On the one side, there were the Central Powers. This alliance was called the Triple Alliance. So initially it involved Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then Germany, who were allies. And the third power to make it a triple alliance was Italy, which initially was on this side. These were the central powers of Europe that, they were in some ways in a position of becoming rivals, especially Germany, of the more Western countries that had a longer tradition of state building and vaster colonial empires overseas. Okay. So on the other hand, we have what then became known as the Allies, and they called themselves the Triple Entente, the Triple Understanding, okay? These included France and England, which were allied against the Central Powers, and then Russia, who saw the Central Powers as a direct menace because, of course, there were bordering areas between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany and Russia, on the west of Russia and the east of Germany and Austria. So it was interesting to see that because of nationalism as a sort of 19th century ideal, when the war was declared, everybody was enthusiastic. The people were enthusiastic on either side, and little did they know what they were going to face. So let's look a little bit at that a little bit. So with the assassination of Sarajevo on the 28th of June of 1914, the Duke of Austria is assassinated by a Serbian patriot. And then the war is declared, and it was like this pretext was needed. What happens that Austria declares war on Serbia. Russia comes to the defense of Serbia. And then Germany gives Russia an ultimatum. So again, already the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente are all at war. The Central Powers and the powers of the Entente. Nobody can be neutral. In fact, Italy remained neutral for 1 year and then entered on the other side in 1915. So now we look at the first map for this chapter that shows us the fronts, the main European fronts of this war. Remember, a war that lasts 4 years is often, especially with the weapons of this time, is going to be a war of trenches. There are fronts that are formed where the two armies face each other and are hiding in trenches that are kind of like ditches excavated digged in the terrain, where a soldier can hide and then peep up and shoot. But often these front lines become stagnant. Nobody moves forward or backwards. It can last for months or for years. So when we look at this map, we see where these fronts were formed. Typically, we have Germany in the middle, and then we have the West Front with France, and the East Front with Russia, and then more south with the Balkans. So on the west front, we actually have the points of Verdun and the Somme. Verdun is where the French the French defended themselves, but against the German invasion, but then they were not able to keep that line, and then Great Britain came in, and then we have the other line called the Somme. And then, of course, we have the Eastern Front where Poland faces Russia, and then the Southeast Front in the area of the Balkans. So all of these, where you see those arrows, those were trenches where the soldiers were hiding, sometimes for months, trying to shoot the enemy, and not to get shot, which was, a sort of no-win situation. And a lot of artillery was used, and also poisonous gases. So we see that not only this sort of modern warfare causes, is bound to produce stalemates, wars that don't advance, but also major environmental devastation. Imagine these front lines, being sort of the terrain of active warfare for years. So we can see that the most significant devastation suffered by modern wars is visited upon the lands where these wars are waged. The planetary life that sustains the human life that suffers most damage. So we see that when a war becomes of this magnitude, the land that is hospitable to human life, where these wars are fought, becomes devastated. And therefore the human lives that inhabit this land are also devastated, regardless if you're a civilian or a military. So then we come to the period of total war. Namely, when a war prolongs itself so long, it affects the civilian population and their habitat. The economy and production has to revolve around the war. We have to make more machine guns, more ammunitions, more of everything that's needed at the front. It does offer sometimes it requires special efforts for women, because the majority of the armies are formed by men. In fact, military service was not even an option for women at that time. So it affects the women who are at home. And sometimes it offers women opportunities to serve in areas where they hadn't served before, in the industry, for example. And that happened a whole lot in industrial countries during World War I. Then we have map 2 that helps us see how the war became World War, that it sort of expanded to a global conflict. We notice, for example, between Africa and India, that's where it was a point of contention between Germany and Britain. And also in East Asia and the Pacific, another area where Germany and Britain were contending for the dominance of the seas, as Germany was expanding its industrial base at home and wanted, more colonies and more colonial territory to dominate. We also see the arrows that show us the troops sent from the US to Europe, and we will come to that, to the intervention of the United States at the end of World War I, which was a determining factor in helping France and England win the war. We also are aware of massacres of populations, entire populations that were casualties of the war, of the larger conflicts of the war. For example, the Armenians were a Christian minority in the Ottoman Empire, which was Islamic. And during this period, they were exterminated by the Turks. It is estimated that about 2 million Armenians perished in this genocide, and many more managed to escape. So how does the war turn toward an end? In a way, we have to be careful. We have to be grateful to the Bolsheviks, because they mounted a major revolution in Russia that overthrew the Tsar and eventually negotiated an early peace with with all the forces of the war, because the socialists thought that this war was an imperialist war. It was a war based on capitalist conflict, and so they wanted to build something entirely different, and they claimed themselves out of it. So how does it go? The Tsarist, we have to understand that Tsarist Russia was not the kind of industrial state that could sustain war alongside Great Britain and France. They had nothing to speak of in terms of armaments, weapons, military techniques, or equipment to sustain the war the way it had become, prolonged in time. And also that the people in Russia lived under what is known as the Blind Absolutism. Remember that Tsar in Russia was the last of the absolutist monarchs, and some people say, this was a blind absolutism because he didn't realize that he was the only one left, that it was perhaps time for a change. So they had no options. The people of Russia, they had no options. They had no industry. They had no civil liberties. So in 1917, under the strain of the war, there were food revolts in Petrograd. And the Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated. So this gave great opportunity to some of the socialists who were in exile. And what happened was that a spontaneous formation of the Soviets. The Soviets were councils of workers that were organized by the socialist leaders. So that's why, the USSR then became the Union of the Socialist Soviet Republics, is because what really saved the day on this abdication was the formation of these councils of workers called the Soviets. So there were two groups, the Mensheviks, who were moderate. They perhaps wanted some kind of reform, a liberal democracy. The Bolsheviks wanted a more radical change, a more radical turnaround of events. And their leader was then in exile. Vladimir Lenin was in exile, but he promptly returned to Russia upon hearing about the upheavals. He was in exile in Switzerland. So when the general insurrection eventually exploded, the Winter Palace, which was the palace of the Tsar, was assaulted, a little bit like the Bastille was assaulted in Paris in the French Revolution. And then the All-Russian National Congress of Soviets came together to deliberate. And at that point, this council negotiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in 1918 to really claim all of Russia out of the war, which of course gave the powers of the Central Powers more force, because now there was one fewer enemy, but also it brought down the power of the war, because now there was a whole region of the world that didn't want anything to do with it. Okay. So yes, the Bolsheviks, who eventually won, were intent in building a socialist state. They had no interest in a capitalist war. And so Germany is now free to turn to the Western Front, okay? Namely, to the front against England and France. And that's when U.S. intervenes, the United States intervenes, it's really the last year of the war, intervenes to help France and Great Britain. And eventually the Central Powers were defeated, and so this war comes to an end. When it comes to an end is when the measure of the damage becomes more apparent. So it is estimated that about 15 million people were killed in World War I, and that about 20 million more were wounded. Okay, and I think another measure of how the whole society was damaged by the war, including the territories where people lived, the habitats, the ecosystem that were hospitable to their lives, is given by the pandemic influenza of 1918 and 1919. During this pandemic influenza, about 20 million people died of the flu. Now imagine that if every time that the flu strikes, 20 million people drop dead. There would be a sort of decimation every year because the influenza happens every year. But why was the influenza so lethal at that time? Because these people had suffered years of deprivation, of food scarcity, of tension due to all the conflicts around them, and therefore their immunity was at a low point that just an influenza would just, wipe them out. So we have a sense with this pandemic of influenza at the extent to which the planet and the population suffered from the war induced by society. So we come then to the Peace of Paris in 1919. Who is at the peace table? The U.S., the United States, with the President Woodrow Wilson. Of course, this last-minute intervention saved the day and then acquired the United States a place at the peace table. And then France with its Prime Minister Clemenceau, and Great Britain with the Prime Minister Lloyd George. The Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were not even called at the peace table, which indicates one reason why the peace didn't last a whole lot. In a way, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had the moral leadership in this peace table. In a way, the U.S. was, of the three countries at the peace table, was the one that had less of a responsibility for starting the war. And so he came up with his 14 points of what would be the rules of this new peace, what would be the leadership, the vision for this peace. Open agreements of peace, freedom of navigation, and a voice to the colonized people. Okay, so the agreements of peace had to be accepted by all parties. The waters of the oceans of the world would be free for navigation, and the people who had been colonized would be heard. Okay. Then in the peace treaties with Germany, okay, there would be no alliance of Germany and Austria again. If Germany and Austria tried to become allied again, that would be against the stipulation. The military force, the military power of Germany would have to be reduced. And there would be a penalty. The cost of the war would be all to be paid by Germany. Okay. So now finally in map 3, we see the nations that were created from the defeat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We remember these sort of nationalist aspirations that hadn't been fulfilled yet. And we observed the new nations of Yugoslavia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and also Hungary, which is now an independent nation, independent of Austria. Also, what Woodrow Wilson encouraged was the formation of the League of Nations that would be a concert of all the nations that would help to preserve the peace. So the other central idea that Woodrow Wilson brought to the table was the self-determination of people. Nations can determine themselves, can exercise self-determination in front of empires. They can reclaim their national independence, freedom from empires. But there was a clause to this. It was believed that some nations were not yet able to stand for themselves, that they wouldn't have the equipment, the preparation, or the experience to really make it on their own. Okay? So in relation to these nations is where the mandate system was created. So these nations would be under the tutelage of the winners of World War I, and especially Great Britain. So this applied to many nations in the Middle East, including Lebanon, Syria, Arabia, and Palestine. And we know what that eventually caused, because this mandate system enabled Britain to continue to exercise a strong influence in those regions, and in a way it didn't really accelerate the pace at which these nations could evolve a diversified economy. And so eventually, when petrol or oil became so important to world economy, that that process was staved off even further, even to our day. Okay, so in a way we see that these wars, the Great War, was caused by Europeans and was resolved by the Soviets, who in Russia claimed themselves out, and by the United States, who intervened. So in a way, the center of power after this war shifts away from Europe. Europe becomes a problem rather than a solution to an addition to the world problems, rather than the seat of where they become resolved. Whereas these emerging powers, become more prominent in world affairs. So we now come to the second chapter of part 7 of our book, Traditions and Encounters. This Part 7 is part of the second volume, and it focuses on contemporary global realignments. Basically, it's really an overview of what happens in the last century of the second millennium, the one that just ended. So this second chapter in part 7 is entitled An Age of Anxiety. So there is a period of a little over 20 years between the two major wars of the 20th century, World War I ending in 1918 and World War II starting, at least in Europe, in 1939. This is also known as the Age of Anxiety. This interwar period is often thought of as an interlude when things didn't really settle. So this chapter focuses on the events, the people, and the cultural modes that are observed in Europe during this period. One can say that the 4 bloody years of World War I have brought into the lives of Europeans in Europe more than a taste of the devastations visited upon the indigenous people of the New World and the peoples of Asia and Africa by the hand of European conquistadors and colonists. So the episteme, or the foundation for knowledge, as well as the cultural mood change. Age of Anxiety. Why? Because the people of Europe are anxious about the monsters they've created, the war machinery they've experimented. The optimism of the 19th century, which especially in the industrial societies had created the illusion that industrialization could resolve all problems if it just expanded, this optimism was gone. Indeed, the 20th century is a time when humans become progressively aware of the fact that a species can be too powerful for its own good, when it is technologically capable of destroying itself and not mature enough to use this power for the common good. So the chapter focuses on 3 areas. First is the cultural frontiers, namely what is the new spirit of the age, or zeitgeist, and what new forms of knowledge or paradigms of knowledge are created. Then there is a part on the global depression that affected the economies of most countries in the world from 1929 well into the 30s. And then a third part focuses on what constituted challenges to the liberal order. In other words, the capitalist liberal order that had resulted in the Great Depression. What alternatives were possible to that? So when we look at probing cultural frontiers, we look at this change in zeitgeist, this change in the paradigms of knowledge. What are the certitudes? And if we have no certitudes, what does that mean? Okay. We notice first a post-war pessimism that is observed in the plots and styles of a number of novels of this time. Hemingway's Farewell to Arms in 1929, All Quiet on the Western Front in the same year, and then another work called Decline of the West in 1918. Then from a social viewpoint, we notice that the belief in progress, that if only the liberal democracy in industrial society could expand to include more people, then this progress would guarantee a better world. That more technologies, more happiness, this belief was lost because now people are aware of what technologies can do, including killing several million people in a trench war and around the lands. From the point of view of faith, or for those who really think in terms of faith, this great war, was evidence of the depravity of human nature, and therefore there was a sort of a counterpoint to the sense of predestination that we have seen in the ideology of manifest destiny. Now, the destiny that was manifest was really indicating something flawed in human nature, according to those who think in terms of faith. From a political viewpoint, we see that the idea that if democracy simply extends progressively its power to include more people, say women or the colonized or those previously enslaved, then things will get better. Now, many people begin to believe that actually democracy is the rule of the inferiors or the mediocre, that it really is a weak form of government that doesn't allow leaders to stand out well enough. And in fact, during this period, still many nations in the early 20th century, still many nations that hadn't done so before, extend the franchise to women. So there is a whole new constituent in the electorate in many nations, including Britain, and then eventually, Germany initially, and then eventually France and England. And the United States. So there is that sense of expansion and inclusiveness, but it is undermined by this sense that there's something wrong with democracy anyway. Especially in the production of knowledge and the field that is often known as science, a crisis, and in other fields as well, a crisis can be an opportunity to think differently. So here we have the period when Einstein, the scientist Einstein, formulates his theory of relativity. As we know today, if we could travel at the speed of light, then time would stop. We cannot, but if we could, then time would stop, because space and time are correlated. Okay, so this is what the theory of relativity of Einstein establishes, that space and time, these two dimensions of existence that we cannot exceed because we're always somewhere and at some point, right, are correlated. Okay, so when people become aware of this correlation, the awareness comes also that everything is relative, because these two major dimensions of existence are correlated. So if one is related to the other, then everything is relative and nothing is absolute in terms of knowledge. A simple comparison will help. When Newton established the law of universal gravity, right, there was a coefficient of acceleration, and everything could be calculated in terms of planetary gravity, cosmic gravity, based on that coefficient. It was a universal law, so an absolute law. Okay? What Einstein does is he says, wait a minute, it's absolute as long as you don't apply this connection of space and time. When you do apply that, then everything becomes relative. So that, of course, shakes people a bit, because all of a sudden there's nothing is certain, everything is relative, nothing is absolute, even in science. Science has to admit to this theory of relativity. Then we look at, the human sciences, and here we see that the early 20th century is when the science of psychoanalysis is founded by Sigmund Freud and his contemporaries, including Carl Jung and Melanie Klein. So what does psychoanalysis study? Psyche means soul in ancient Greek. So psychoanalysis studies the soul. Now, this is a major revolution for people's minds because up to this point, it was believed that the soul was the province of religion and belief systems, that a scientific method could not be applied to this province that really was based on faith. But now the soul becomes the object of scientific inquiry. And in fact, psychoanalysis interrogates the nature of sexuality and gender. And one of our readings, Freud's essay on femininity, is a prime example of that, and claims that there is a whole realm in our soul, in our inner life, in our inner landscape, that is subconscious, namely that we don't even know it very well, that it happens sometimes beyond our will or reason. So in a way, when a new science claims that it's going to study the soul, this goes well beyond what were the desires of the Enlightenment, right? Studying society and seeing how it could work better, which is really the origins of the human science we know as sociology, and also the scientific practice of cultural relativism that was initiated by Montesquieu, which then evolved into the human science of anthropology. This is a little more radical because now the individual soul, this evanescent, ethereal essence, is being studied by science. So people have to wrap their minds around it, around this concept. So finally, we see a major epistemic change, a change in the foundation of knowledge, or a paradigmatic shift, also in the arts. Now artists want to express their impressions. They want to express their feelings, their emotion, their inner reality, rather than be anchored to what they called the sovereignty of appearance. The sovereignty of appearance. Of course, the fact that now photography also exists help, because if I need a portrait, I'm going to hire a photographer rather than a painter, as happened in the Renaissance. So in a way, one of the more, the role of certain roles that art had before are now fulfilled by the techniques of photography. So here, to really drive the point home, we're going to look at two images. One is a famous painting by Picasso in his Cubist phase. This painting is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Young Women of Avignon. And then we are going to look at a classic of the Italian Renaissance, the painting by Raphael called The Marriage of Mary. Okay, so let's have these two images in mind for a moment. Okay, in the Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, we see the style of Cubism. We see all these bodies are sort of decomposed in different geometric forms, and some of the faces are not quite human. So the painting expresses the primitive aspects of human nature. It also decomposes the human body to reflect a state of mind of the beholder. How is this viewer, this painter, viewing these objects? It's not how they appear to, say, a photographer, but rather how the viewer, what's in the eye of the beholder, of the painter who sees them. And from Cubism, many other movements also follow in the same mode: Expressionism, Dadaism, and Surrealism. They all want to get rid of this sovereignty of appearance. So if we look instead for a moment more at the classic by High Renaissance painter Raphael, The Marriage of Mary, we see the dominance of symmetry. Everything is organized around a vanishing point, which is exactly at the center of the central window of the temple. This vanishing point provides the illusion of three-dimensionality. This is a two-dimensional painting, but you see the depth of field focused on, concentrated in the vanishing point and the perspective. So everything follows the appearance, right? You know, everyone is painted exactly the way like a camera would see them. Okay, there is naturalism, and you know there is all this sort of portraiture, you know, the tyranny of appearance. However, if we look at this painting more closely, we found out that there's nothing natural in it. If you imagine Mary in Palestine getting married to Joseph, you know that she wasn't dressed like a lady of the Renaissance. She didn't have the kind of clothing and attire that this portrait of Mary does. So you see how the shift is from, you know, from this tyranny of appearance, right, that isn't necessarily naturalistic or realistic because there are the conventions of the time, right? Raphael's Mary is like a, you know, a lady of his time. She's dressed like a Renaissance lady. Okay, so there's a lot of imagination there. But the tyranny of appearance is what causes, you know, what produces the structure of the painting. Whereas in the Demoiselle d'Avignon, we see that the inner reality, the state of mind of the painter is what produces the structure of the painting. We shift now our focus to the economic sphere. We look at how the global depression that affected the economies of the world from 1929 until well into the 30s, how it evolved, how it was made possible. One first consideration is that the cycles of expansion and contraction that we have observed alongside our study, our brief study of a global history, they've always been present. So therefore, we understand that they are typical of human history. But in the capitalist order, these cycles of contraction and expansion become more frequent and more intense. So the global depression is the first global sign of the intensity and frequency of these expansions and contraction when the world economy operates under the capitalist order. So sure enough, the contraction comes in October of 1929. The contraction with respect of the previous expansion that lasted until at least the beginning of World War I, and then in many countries, including the United States, even continued up to the end of the third decade of the 20th century. Okay, how does the contraction come? It comes with the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange. In just one day, in October of 1929, fortunes are lost because a stock that would have been worth $100 were now worth maybe a few cents. So this moment starts what is known as the Great Depression. And we have to remember that really the first year was not the worst one because not many people had stock. So, those people who had stock lost their wealth, but most people didn't own stocks at that time, so they were not immediately affected. So the Great Depression became so great because the world economies were interconnected. For example, we know that Germany had to pay these war reparations according to the Peace of Paris to Great Britain and France. So Germany was getting loans from the U.S. to repay those war debts. And then Great Britain and France were paying back the U.S. For their war loans, the fact that they had needed help to fight the Central Powers in World War I. So you can see with that is all these interconnections, if there's a crash somewhere, it's going to quickly expand very widely. You know, one of these crashes can happen when there is a lot of investment that cannot sustain its pace because it's too explosive, it's just too much, and then it collapses. Okay. At this time, there is also a crisis in agriculture. There is a surplus production, and therefore the prices of agricultural products fall, which of course affects agricultural laborers and farmers. Also, as technologies evolve, colonial economies are affected because, for example, a certain amount of rubber was necessary to power certain technologies. If the technology evolves, then much less rubber might be necessary, and therefore the economies of certain colonies that really are organized around the monoculture of rubber may collapse as well. So by all these factors, we see how all these economies are interconnected, and therefore the contraction spreads from the New York Stock Exchange very rapidly. We see, first of all, in Germany, where rampant inflation is produced. Inflation that to the point that, you know, before, when you would get paid and then would do the groceries, your money was already worth half of it, of what you were paid. So it was really difficult for the common people to cope with this level of inflation. We have to also realize that not all the world economies were industrialized in equal percentages. Okay, so the more an economy was industrialized, the more it was immediately affected, because industrial production is more related to commerce. Whereas an economy that really was still largely based on a sustainable production, where people would produce what they needed, was less directly affected. Because, you know, maybe your salary wasn't enough to go buy a chicken, but if you had your own chicken, you still had them, regardless of what happened on the stock market exchange. So clearly, in response to these effects of the economic collapse, something called economic nationalism surged. So, you know, national governments would impose tariffs on imports, but then other governments would do the same. So basically, this produced a block in trade of about 66%. You know, with everyone having their own tariffs, exports and imports became very difficult, and by and large a production drop of 38%. You see how the magnitude of the depression, and we're talking about the years between 1929 and 32. So if you think of the classical capitalist thinking of the progressive era, of the time of when the industrial economies were established, the idea came from the economist Adam Smith, and the idea was laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French word that says, let it do itself, let it be, okay? The idea was that there was an invisible hand that moves the economy for the best, and so the least governments intervene, the better it is for this system to just evolve by itself. So at this time, many people realize that this philosophy is a problem, because if you adopt this idea of laissez-faire, what happens is that, you know, these cycles of contraction and expansion become more frequent, more intense, and more devastating. So many governments realize that there is a need for intervention. And here we go to the thinking of another economist, Maynard Keynes. Okay? Contrary to Adam Smith, what Maynard Keynes thinks is that the government can be an agent in the economy, not a simple mirror or even just a regulator. Okay? So a government can make its own investments that can jumpstart the economy during a crisis. And these investments can also be made in projects that have long-term effects. So this is basically the philosophy that is adopted by the President of the United States at this time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was born in 1882 and died in 1945. And it echoes the Enlightenment idea expressed by Rousseau, the idea of a social contract, a government that is an agent in the economy and therefore negotiates with the people what it is that they need. Do you guys need jobs now? Okay, I will create a public project that will employ people. So not only that, this direct intervention, but also a regulating effect. For example, FDR also established minimum wage, social security. The social security system that we have today was established at this time. Certain regulations for bank activities and subsidies for those who create jobs or for those who take them, so that more people can stay employed. I want to give just a few examples of how during the New Deal the government became an agent in the economy. I don't know if you ever visited Colorado, but in Colorado there's a river called Colorado River, and this river was dammed at this time by one of the major dams of its time. Today there are even bigger dams, but at that time that was considered a dam of an unprecedented magnitude, and this is the Hoover Dam. At that time there was a lot of faith in hydroelectric power, how to produce electricity with waterfalls or with the pressure of water. It was considered very progressive, and also there wasn't enough awareness of the local environmental devastation that would produce or the long-term effects. But this said, the Hoover Dam is a result of the projects of the New Deal. In other words, there was a need for employment. The government would say, okay, we will invest public resources in the creation of a project that may have long-term beneficial effect for many people, and that can, in the immediate, employ some workers who are unemployed. Another area of action for the New Deal was that of bringing capital, the capital that the new rich of the industrial age were hiding from the economy, to bring it back into the economy, to tell these ultra-rich families, look, you're hiding your money away, we know that, and instead of directly taxing you, like expropriating your money, we offer you an opportunity to bring it back into the economy in the form of foundations. If you look at these names, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, we know them as names of foundations of these rich, the new rich of the industrial age, who decided, encouraged by the New Deal policies, to create foundations so that they would bring some of their wealth back into the economic system. It was an alternative to direct taxation, and it was a way in which they could indirectly influence certain factors in the economy. I don't know, train economists, for example, with a Carnegie Fellowship, right? So they were offered the opportunity to do something that they believed in, while bringing back this hidden money into the economy that was missing it. Also at this time, the system of progressive taxation was created, so that if your income was higher, you wouldn't pay the same as a poor person, but you would pay progressively in relation to your income. So the policies of the New Deal were not a direct challenge to the liberal order. They did not frontally attack the ideology of laissez-faire, that capitalism knows how to rule itself, but they were definitely an improvement on the effects, the savage effects of capitalism as they were visited upon the people who suffered from the Great Depression.